so we can share the benefit of this with many people. Welcome. You are very welcome to Fabian Women's Network. Economics is Still for Girls, the return, week 1. We're doing another 4-week series on Wednesday evenings during June, kicking off this evening and running till the 30th of June, around economic education and upskilling, because we know we have many brilliant members who are expert in many things, and sometimes people perceive that they don't know about a topic like economics when actually they do, or maybe you just lack confidence to talk about it, or maybe there's a particular aspect of it you want to learn more about so that you feel more confident in discussing it. This evening we're absolutely delighted and honoured to have, we've got so many good speakers, it's crazy, and just extra thanks though to Bridget Phillipson MP for squeezing us into her very busy diary. Thank you. You came to speak for us in the first series, and we're delighted to have you again, Bridget, so we look forward to that. And then we have got an array of outstanding councillors from across the country who are going to take us through local government finance in a very practical fashion. Do come back next week for tax. Doesn't need to be taxing, with Dame Angela Eagle. We've got UK Tax Justice and Bernie Smith taking us through that. The following week, 23rd of June, we've got Feminist Green Economy. We're delighted to have Preet Kaur Gill MP with us, who's Shadow International Development. We've got Anne Pettifor, Alice Kugler, and a representative from the Women's Budget Group. So that promises to be another smasher of a week. And on the 30th of June, we are wrapping up with a session led by Councillor Mariana Masters, who recently became the FWN Treasurer. So very aptly, she'll be leading on that session for us, and that's kind of making sure that we all feel super confident to go out there and talk about economics. And again, we've got lots of speakers that will help facilitate that very interactive session that hopefully will draw together the threads of these past weeks. So thanks for being here on this balmy evening as lockdown lifts. Please tell all your friends about FWN, tweets about this evening. We're recording it so people can watch it afterwards. And just, it's wonderful to have you here. And I'm delighted this evening to hand over now to our chair, Councillor Mariah Priestley, who has helped us put together this evening and this outstanding panel of brilliant Fabian women. Mariah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. In fact, I think you've said it all with regards to the calibre of women we have lined up for you ladies this evening. It does promise to be a really lively event, full of lots of, how do you say, discussion, lively discussion, and we hope it will be constructive, and I'm sure with the women we have around the table, it's bound to be so. I think what I will say is that this first week is really about the brass tacks and looking at the foundations of economics. So for you ladies who actually know quite a lot about it, you may want to sort of reflect on what's being said and add value to some of the sessions. For those who are coming in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, get your notepads out, because we have a really strong lineup of speakers, people like, I think we have Josie on the line who's facilitating, we have Lucia De Nevis who is also facilitating sessions, we have Sarah Russell, and we also have Denise who are talking about the combination of nuts and bolts, and also how local government finance relates to economics and also to regeneration. So fantastic lineup, ladies. Without further ado, let me introduce Bridget, who we all know is taken up the reins within Whitehall, working with our colleagues. Bridget, as we all know, is the Labour MP for Horton and Sunderland South, one of the 3 constituencies in the city of Sunderland. And at the moment, she is currently working as the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I hope I'm current in that. Okay, I can see Bridget nodding, so I haven't forgotten the proper title. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, Bridget, and we're all waiting to hear some of the key things you are going to be sharing with us, and I'm sure there are lots of questions coming your way. So I'll hand over to you straight away. Over to you, Bridget.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mariah. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you for inviting me. And thanks to you, to Mariana, to Sarah, and everyone on the committee for all the work that you do in organising women's events, but also this, I think, really important and worthwhile series. And it sounds like you've got great discussions going on right throughout the evening. I hope you won't think it ungracious of me to admit that when I was initially asked to come along and talk about local government finance, I wasn't entirely filled with complete enthusiasm, but actually the way I want to talk about some of it this evening is hopefully a way of introducing some of the thornier intellectual and I think above all political challenges that face us both as a party in opposition and in power, both nationally and locally. And that's because local government finance raises a number of questions which have bedeviled public debate and been the subject of much internal discussion within our movement for over a century. Questions general to taxation decisions, such as whether people or property or income or a mix of these should be taxed to raise the funds local government needs. Questions general to spending decisions. So as a society, we strike a balance between universal services and focusing our spend on those in most need, and how we ensure that areas and communities that need more spending to reach the same level of service do get a fair deal. Questions general to democratic societies, such as the limits, if any, that the legal system places on individual councils in any given year on the change that they can make around levels of spending and the precise services that they provide. Questions about the allocation of resources across a divided country, a divided society and unequal country, and how we ensure that decent services are available in every corner of our country, even where local taxation is inadequate to the challenge of funding at all. Questions about the relationship between central government and our individual towns, villages, cities and communities. Questions about the balance between the money we spend on fixing the problems of today and the money we spend on avoiding problems tomorrow, or more prosaically between revenue and capital. And questions about how we align democratic power with fiscal responsibility, which recur at every level of government, not just locally and centrally. I'm not going to be able to explore all of these points this evening, but what I do want to get across is that local government finances raises questions for us on the left as a set of issues that don't simply have always technical answers. And the answers are instead unavoidably political, because they involve making trade-offs between sometimes unpalatable options and making the best of choices between different preferred outcomes. And what I also hope to illustrate is how thorny some of these challenges are, and also how different the challenges, how different the set of trade-offs are between different areas of our country. I'll be talking this evening only about English local government, not because of my lack of interest in the situation in Wales and Scotland, but because the matter is devolved and my Labour colleagues at Westminster will only be dealing with the situation in England directly, and also because English local government offers illustration of the complexities of many of these questions. I've also got to try and simplify things further by talking almost entirely about revenue spending, so day-to-day spending on services and on staffing, rather than the questions around how you might spend capital on offices or housing, or those kind of bigger questions there. So I'll start off with just a bit of the context. In 2019-20, the financial year that ended with the beginning of the COVID pandemic, English local government spend, again just revenue spending, was a little over £98 billion. And if we chop out the emergency funding for COVID, that comes down to just £96 billion. So just over half of that money, 48.3 billion, comes from central government grants. Of that, over 25 billion is direct funding to be passed on to schools. The last Labour government introduced that mechanism to make sure that central government could ensure that schools were getting the funds which Parliament was determined to resource them with, rather than allowing councils to move it elsewhere or to spend it on other things. And the remaining 48 billion comes mainly from council tax, £31 billion, and business rates at 17 billion. Business rates are set nationally, even though they're retained locally. And while the level of council tax is set locally, the framework for how it's set and how the different bands are collected is set nationally too. So alongside restrictions on much of how much it can go up each year. So even locally collected taxes come with very little discretion about the level of tax and essentially no local say over the distributional impact of that tax. So at a very simple level, half the funding that local government provides comes from local taxation, half from central government. And perhaps the question is, why doesn't it all come from locally raised funds? People often ask that question. Would it not make more sense to align local funding with local spending? Well, I'd say yes and no. On one level, yes, it would. At another, we have to be alive to the wider consequences of that in a country where the distribution of wealth and income is very heavily patterned. And if local spending did all come from local taxation, then without much wider reforms, two things would change, and hopefully the extent of those problems will become clear. One is that the tax could be lower on individuals and properties and business activity in prosperous areas, both because there's more to tax and also because need in those areas often tends to be lower. And the other flip side of that is that services might tend to be worse because funding from them was harder to raise in the areas with the most serious need. So what sounds like a simple question, aligning tax raising powers directly with financial requirements at a local level, doesn't necessarily always have welcome consequences for those of us on the left who want to see a country with more equal outcomes. And I want now to go back to that nice clear picture, half the funding provided centrally, half from local taxation of various forms, that it starts to fall apart when we look at different councils, or more precisely different forms of councils. Because like most neat clear pictures, it hides more than it reveals. So for those of us who live in areas like London or Milton Keynes and Sunderland, where the council has responsibility for education, obviously our schools will be getting some of that dedicated schools grant. And you'll remember that that accounts for around £1 in every 4 spent on running costs by English local government in total, and that comes directly from central government. But for district councils in areas of England where there are 2 tiers of local councils, places like Oxfordshire and Norfolk, they don't run schools or provide public health services, so their money comes more from council tax and business rates. So for London boroughs, less than a quarter of the money needed to fund running costs comes from council tax. For district councils in areas with 2 tiers of councils, around 56% comes from council tax. Obviously that seems fair enough, but I think it's worth thinking through some of the odder consequences. What it means is that for those district councils in places like Oxford and Norwich, their budgets considered as a whole are much more sensitive to changes in the level of council tax than are the budgets of London boroughs. If a democratically run London borough puts up council tax by 1%, it has much less impact on its overall budget than if a democratically run rural district council were to do the same thing. So the responsiveness of the fiscal burden on taxpayers to democratic control varies right across the country. Now that's sort of inevitable as soon as you start providing central funding, but it's worth considering whether we think it's a problem and how much of a problem it is. And there isn't a simple, straightforward answer to this. It really is a political call. And that points to an informative international comparison. If we set aside business rates set as a nationally set tax, then the UK is very unusual in the low level of funding set locally for local government. Across the OECD, the club of richer countries, we're in the bottom 5 countries for the extent to which local services are funded by local taxation. Almost everywhere else, a higher proportion of subnational spending is met through subnational taxation. Again, it's not obvious that the international comparison is a good thing one way or another, it's just different. What's perhaps even more surprising is that the proportion of local government spending which is funded by council tax has itself risen sharply over the last 10 years. But of course, the reason for that is simple enough. Central government grants have been cut so that council tax will seem to go up as a share because the overall level is much further down. So you can move towards aligning local spending and local revenue by the simple and very effective, if cynical, expedient of cutting money centrally. And lastly, I just want to cover some of the challenges that our existing council tax itself poses. You may know that the comparative valuations on which it depends from bands A to H and indeed to I in Wales come from 20 to 30 years ago. And you may know that the amounts charged for each band are all related to one another, at all different numbers of ninths of the band D rate, in a way set down from central government, so councils can't change the rating of how progressive the tax is. And you may recollect that its predecessor was the wildly unpopular poll tax, a flat tax at the same amount on every elector. But I think it's worth thinking about why what was essentially a rushed compromise has lasted so long, and some of the challenges it presents to the next Labour government, because it points to how an issue can become a very political one, involving a lot of intensely political trade-offs in a very short space of time. One reason is that the banding is based on the housing market as it stood back in 1991, and as such, any revaluation would reflect the immense change in the housing market since then, and also how prices have gone up relative to incomes in some places much more than in others. So in London in 2020, median house prices to median gross earnings is at a ratio of 12.5. In the Northeast, where I'm from, it's at almost exactly 5, But 20 years ago, those numbers were 6.9 in London and 3.3 in the North East, so very different. And in those 2 decades, housing costs, the share of income, haven't just risen, they've diverged very sharply on a regional basis. So the housing market has arguably been failing to work as a way of distributing housing to people who need it, and it's become a way of investing in assets. And the people who own these assets are often not the people who are living in them. And that makes using housing cost assets as a foundation for the property tax element of council tax challenging to update effectively. The other is that if the nettle is grasped, as it was being grasped in 2006-07 by the last Labour government, people rapidly become extremely worried. And that's predictable, as we all know from behavioural economic research. People are far more concerned by the risk of small diminution to their income than they are attracted by the equivalent small increases to their income. It's a much wider problem for progressive parties from opposition, of course, but it's particularly a problem when people who would pay a tax think that they can work out what would happen from a review of it. And one of the clever things that the Tories did in 2017 was to seize on a mention of a potential land tax in Labour's manifesto and to serve hundreds of thousands of social media adverts about how Labour would start taxing people's gardens. And it's a very difficult, politically thorny problem. But what it means is that a tax which at the start was an unhappy hybrid of the rates and the poll tax, with taxation of property in which people live coupled to a discount for those who live alone, and with no obvious easy reforms, has become a prisoner of the extent of change since it was created, and there being as a result no straightforward and easy ways to reform it. Simple revaluation in terms of its existing structure might seem right from some perspectives and has the advantage of being easy to describe, but risks being thought to create many losers and few obvious winners. A more complex review will be very difficult to do in isolation from a much wider review of what local government is for and whether it has the powers, and particularly whether it has the fiscal powers that reflect the challenges that face our country today, as opposed to 50 years ago when the basic structure of English local government was set down. And that's as it should be. It would be odd to take it as read that local government needs the same powers today as it needed in 1972, and that all we need to do is change the financing system, just as it would be odd to make wholesale changes to the structure of local government without reviewing the financial system that supports spending. So we'll need to think about those two things together. And I hope what I've said here, and I'll come to an end now, has started to illustrate that these are really intensely political discussions about the sort of local government we want, what we mean when we say we want to bring decisions closer to people, what the outcomes of that can be, sometimes the unintended consequences of what starts as a well-meaning conversation about how we give people choice and control over their lives, and how we tackle inequality across our country, and how we make sure that we've got services, good quality local services, wherever you happen to live. And as Keir has put it, how we make our country the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bridget. That was certainly a packed 10 minutes or 12 minutes, because I know that we handed over to you a little bit earlier. Wow, there is so much to consider in that in that presentation, and I think from my point of view, lots of questions to ask. We've moved into the session now for Q&A. In terms of the logistics of that, I think we have Emily online who may be able to help us with how we manage Q&A. Do people send in questions, or can they just indicate with their hand and we unmute them? Emily, what's your thought?
However people would rather. I think Alexandra's got a question, so we can, if Alexandra, if you'd like to unmute, and then anyone else who has a question, maybe pop it in the chat, and then we can go, and then I can see Liz as well has got one as well, so we can go to you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you so much for that. That was really fascinating. And it's an area that I'm particularly interested in myself. This is sort of a twofold question in a sense. In the UK, as far as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that we have one of the highest property taxes in the Western world. Now, how does Labour go about convincing voters, or wannabe voters more to the point, that a re-evaluation, for example, of council tax might be a good idea when you look at areas like Camden, where I live, which has got an extremely high council tax as it stands? And also, if there is a re-evaluation, how do you convince people that those who can't afford it won't fall within that loophole? This is such a complex area, because you have, for example, elderly individuals who may be asset rich and cash poor. So would that reevaluation be part sort of connected to income, for instance? So it's a very loose question, but I'm just trying to get into the nitty gritty of it, because I've given it a lot of thought myself. Thank you.
Do you want me to take a question at a time, Mariah? Is that?
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
okay.
please.
Yeah, brilliant. I think really you both asked the question and answered it yourself in what you said there, Alexandra, which is that it is a very thorny issue, and it's part of the reason that what was initially designed, as I said, as a stopgap and a compromise decades ago has endured, even though it isn't the ideal solution really. I think, as I said, I don't believe you could really separate any changes around council tax from a wider kind of broader reconsideration of powers that are exercised locally. Yeah. And also I think a wider question around the fact that we've seen need effectively divorced from central government funding when it's directed locally. So no longer are we in a position where those parts of the country that may have extra need where it comes to children's services or adult social care or a whole range of other services that are delivered locally, necessarily there is a connection between the difficulties faced within an area with the need that's presenting and with the challenges. The government have decoupled that over the course of the last decade, and the same is true in lots of areas, whether it's police funding or public health spending, a whole host of different areas. So I think you would need to take all of that together as part of a wider consideration about how you seek to have a framework that understands the differences within communities and between communities, but does ensure that there is a good minimum standard wherever you happen to live, because it shouldn't rest entirely on that kind of locally raised revenue. Yeah. But I think the political risks, as I said, are quite strong, because on lots of questions around taxation, and this is no different, what you put forward can be open to deliberate misrepresentation by your political opponent. So you need to be very clear that whatever you arrive at is both worked through, well understood and easy to communicate, because if it isn't, you can bet your life that your political opponents will convey a very different message, very different from the initial intention. And even in areas, you need only look at the mess that the Conservatives got into in 2017 with opening up a discussion around social care to see how it can very quickly morph into a very difficult political challenge. And I think it caused the Conservatives significant harm. I think it also made it more difficult for and has led to a failure to properly reform social care, which after a decade is in a much more difficult position. And we still await the government's plans in this area. So sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded way of saying I think you have to take many of the different aspects of it all together, because it's just not straightforward at all. And I think you illustrate many of the potential political risks associated with that kind of approach.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Can we move to Liz? I think I saw a hand up with you, Liz. Please go ahead.
Hi, Bridget. So you've talked about council tax, and that was really interesting. Obviously, I also have to pay business rates, which is just as political. And as you know, the business rate system is just as broken as the council tax system. I've had my VOA forms in the last couple of weeks, and obviously there's going to be a big political issue of how do we set business rates for businesses that have been closed down over the last year. So I mean, it's another huge topic for you, but I wonder what your thoughts were about how we could reform business rates and local business taxation.
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, again, on this, as with council tax, there are areas that we from opposition can consider, but we're not in a position to do a great deal about it right now, much to my frustration. I hope before too long we'll be in a position to to arrive at some of these decisions ourselves. I think on the issue of business rates, I mean, it comes up time and again. You know, you've mentioned it, but in all discussions I have with particularly small businesses and with high streets, business rates is often, you know, the number one issue that they will raise. We also, you know, more broadly don't have that level playing field where it comes to, or anywhere near a level playing field where it comes to bricks and mortar businesses and the online tech giants. I mean, you will have seen that there was the announcement coming out of the G7 following on from Joe Biden's proposal around a global minimum corporation tax. We think the government could have gone further on that and could have pushed for 21% as Biden initially proposed. It's not at all clear that it will, that there won't be loopholes that can still be exploited by some of the big online tech giants. And it's essential that we're not in a position where, you know, local businesses, small businesses who are absolutely the lifeblood of our communities are at an unfair disadvantage relative to those tech giants, but also that we end up losing revenue that could be used to fund public services, that could be put towards many of the big challenges we face right now as a country, whether it's, you know, children's well-being, our schools, adult social care, a whole range of different issues. On business rates in particular, we are considering this as part of Labour's High Streets Commission. So we'll be looking closely at those issues and what we would want to be saying on that. But, you know, we do recognise that business rates remains, you know, one of the biggest issues facing many small businesses in particular. And if we want to have vibrant high streets, then we do need to make sure that we've got the right model in place for supporting businesses to thrive and to expand and to take on more people.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Liz, any follow-up questions or any comeback on that?
Well, I mean, as Bridget knows, I've got a lot to say about local businesses and small businesses, the high street, the hospitality industry. So hopefully we'll keep on this conversation. I hope, fingers crossed, you'll be at the Women Business Fringe event, that you've had the invite for that. I think what we'd really want to see is Labour having a conversation with, you know, people who haven't been paying business rates, who have had closed businesses, to see, you know, what Labour can do to shout for us. I think that a lot of small businesses are feeling that, you know, there's huge power imbalances in our industries. So it's the big players that actually get to talk to government. And, you know, there's a lot of issues of small businesses, like, you know, rent repayments, the beer tie, all sorts of those issues that we are just not getting to talk to government about at all. So yeah, hopefully we'll carry on that conversation. And, you know, I'm waiting for my call up for the High Street Commission so I can tell you about what we've been talking about.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Liz. We've got another couple of minutes to go before we let Bridget go, because she's done a sterling job. Excuse me, I have my little one coming in and out, so don't mind her as she comes to check on mummy every 2 minutes. Is there any question remaining? Emily, please go for it.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much, Bridget. We've already mentioned briefly about the impacts of the pandemic on local government finances. I just wanted to sort of pick your brain and hear your thoughts a bit more on how, for example, when you sort of raise these concerns around lots of local authorities struggling and lots of different councils struggling, the Tories in response often list numbers that they've invested, and that's reasons, you know, that councils should be doing okay, and they use it as sort of a tick box of, no, actually we've been funding them correctly. I was just wondering, from perspective of politically, how does Labour sort of cut through that noise and really make the case that there is the need for further funding and further investment from central government to local authorities, without sort of seeming like it's endless, a wish list of, you know, the money tree and that sort of thing? How do we make that balance politically with messaging?
You're absolutely right. I mean, and it's actually a very difficult one, because, you know, local people will often look to their local councils for the level of service that's provided, and then those of you who are councillors have the difficult job of explaining that the money that you receive from central government has reduced significantly. and there's a reason why you can't do quite what you would like to do, and it's not possible to achieve everything within that kind of envelope that you have. I think what was really frustrating during the pandemic was that, you know, Robert Jenrick had said right at the start that, you know, councils will be backed up, whatever it would take, whatever was needed. And then that very quickly was, you know, not honoured. And he reneged on the promises that he'd made. And that's after, of course, a decade of a very tight spending settlement for local councils, but also with many local councils facing huge additional pressures that weren't there back in 2010. You know, I look at the level of demand in my local area for children's services, particularly the increase that we've seen around child protection and the increases in the number of children that require additional support. Also, the big demographic change that we see around social care, and that's, you know, often people will think that we're simply talking about older people who need support to live independently, but of course we have, you know, it's a wonderful thing that we have many more younger disabled people living independent lives in a way that, you know, we wouldn't have thought would be possible just a number of years ago or a decade or so ago. So it's wonderful that that's the case, but, you know, they have support needs and they need that level of the level of support that, you know, they have a right to expect in order to live full, independent and dignified lives. So I think connecting it very much to what people want to see within their communities is a really important part of it. But I won't pretend it's easy, and I don't envy the task that many of you will have as councillors in seeking to communicate whilst you're doing all you can for your local communities, and we'll be achieving great successes. And I think we've seen, you know, there are some wonderful examples of what local councils and also Labour in power in Wales have managed to achieve even with that. And, you know, I think with the Welsh Labour government, the different response that we've seen around aspects of the pandemic, the greater prioritisation given to small businesses, the way in which they've capped some of that relief so it's more effectively targeted than some of the Westminster schemes. So there's great examples that we can point to, but I know it's often very challenging in explaining why sometimes tough decisions do have to be made, and that in part comes to the lack of balance around the central spend that will come, and the greater push to make, you know, local revenue a greater proportion of what is spent. And for many councils, particularly Labour-run councils, that can be a real challenge. So, you know, it's you know, Labour in arriving into government in 2024 would find, you know, a very difficult, it would be in a very difficult position in seeking to address some of these questions. And I don't pretend it's easy, but hats off to those of you who are grappling with this day in, day out and seeking to do the best that you can for your residents, because it's remarkable what you are still able to achieve given the constraints.
Great, thank you so much, Bridget. And I think Karen has a question next.
That's right. Emily, can I just ask, I think I also have Lucia who wants to ask a question, is that right?
Yeah.
Lucia? So if we can take both questions, please, from Karen and Lucia back to back, and ask Bridget to respond to both of them so we can close this session up. Thank you. Please go ahead, Karen, and then Lucia.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. It was really pleasing to hear you talk about adult social care so positively. And I think you're right. Local government is where innovation happens. We know our communities and we know how to meet their needs in a way that a national system or a nationally run system wouldn't necessarily. But my question really around the finances is how we as a party would tackle and support local government to fund adult social care properly. Clearly with something like the Precept, we know council tax is a hugely regressive taxation system. The Precept disadvantages poor people where demand is highest. So what's our alternative? What's our answer to that?
Thanks, Bridget. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the relationship between some of the challenges that you've talked about and women and the challenges that we in local government might be addressing around the 52% of the population and specific barriers that they might face.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I'll try and keep this as quick as possible, but they're two absolutely massive and very important issues. So I'll try and do them justice, but I'm probably not going to cover everything, I'm afraid. I'll just start on, you know, around women. I suppose I'll just, not just talking specifically about local government, but I'll just talk about women in the economy as well right now, because you probably are as a better place than I am to talk about what, you know, the role that councils can play in kind of a push to greater gender equality. I think more broadly, where it comes to women and the economy, I'm often frustrated that much of the discussion around investment in infrastructure is understood in terms purely of bricks and mortar, government ministers in high vis, you know, stood at bypasses, when for me, you know, investing in our national infrastructure involves investing in our people and investing in the systems, particularly that support women to be in paid employment and to manage family life, because it all too often still falls to women to hold everything together. So I think infrastructure should also be about social care and about childcare, not simply just the roads network or trains, important though they are to our national infrastructure. I think we need to look again at that wider question of what it is we mean. And that takes, and the impact of the pandemic on women I'm particularly concerned about could well unravel much of the progress that we've made, and that progress is all too often very fragile. And we've seen particularly the impact during the pandemic on many Black, Asian and minority ethnic women in particular, but also, you know, the pressures faced by many of our childcare providers, and the fact that women are more likely to have been furloughed, more likely to have lost their jobs, and have been responsible for seeking to kind of keep the show on the road at home often, with looking after children and doing everything whilst schools were closed had closed their doors to many children. I think more broadly on the issue of adult social care, I think you're right, Karen, we do need to speak positively about what social care can do and how it can really make a difference to people's lives, and talk about who it is we're talking about as well. So important as it is that we have very high quality social care for our older citizens, it also covers many younger people, many working age adults with disabilities who need that support in order to be in the workplace, in order to live fulfilled lives, in order to, you know, be able to, you know, do what many of us would simply take for granted. So I think, you know, that is incredibly important. I mean, the government have brought forward a number of different proposals over the years. I think and none of it's stuck. We're still awaiting the government's proposals around this. Sadly, some of what they'd brought forward previously is often out of date. I think, you know, there's work underway in the party around precisely what our response on that would be. But, you know, I think it's disingenuous for the government to say that they want to seek a cross-party solution, when actually they've got a large majority and could implement social care reform right now if they so chose. We know that the Prime Minister told us he had a plan ready to go, which has never materialised in the 2 years since Johnson became Prime Minister. But I think a really important part of the sector where we have had a very clear message is that we need to ensure that we have good quality jobs that are well paid, well resourced, with good training running alongside it, because there are such huge numbers of vacancies within social care. It's predominantly done by women. It's not valued and respected in the way that it should be. And I think when we talk about green jobs, going back to that point about infrastructure, people often think we mean, you know, retrofitting homes. Again, very important that we do that. Again, really important that we have more wind turbines, but you don't get a more green job than working in social care and supporting some of the more vulnerable people in our community. So I think we need to look at afresh really at all of these big questions about what we prioritise, what matters to us as a society, and how we value the work that often it's women who will be doing in making that change and in that shift to a greener economy. I think we need to talk about social care and childcare as much as we talk about solar panels and retrofitting homes. I could say a lot more, but I shall leave it there because I appreciate you've got plenty to get on with this evening.
Thank you very much, Karen and Lucia, for those questions, and many thanks, Bridget, for such a comprehensive answer to 4 or 5 questions. And I mean, certainly I sort of jotted notes down in terms of things I need to follow up, but probably not burden you with that this evening. I might send you an email or two. I'd like to, on behalf of the organising committee, just thank you for attending this evening. You're very welcome to stay and, you know, eavesdrop on everything else going on, but I know somebody in your role has a million other things to get on with, but you're always welcome here anytime to FWN, and our thanks to you.
Thank you very much for having me, Mariah, and thanks for chairing, and hope the rest of the evening goes really well.
Thank you, Bridget.
See you later. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Okay, I know we're running a few minutes behind time, but no problem, because we can actually pick up some things some time later on through our plenary session and cut back on that. It's my pleasure to introduce Denise, who I think I saw this evening. I'm looking through the, yes, you're already there. Denise will be talking to us about the nuts and bolts of economics within a local government setting, and probably with some added value of her own. Bit of background, Denise is a cabinet member for the economy in Greenwich. I hope I'm right. And so I know this is
well, you're slightly, well, no, don't worry. There was a cabinet reshuffle, but I was economy about a week ago.
Okay, you've moved. Oh, wow.
Through regeneration, but don't worry about
fabulous,
that.
fabulous. Well, I'm sure you can throw some light and mix the two up for us to make things more exciting. Over to you, Denise.
Okay, thank you, Maura. That was a fabulous discussion by Bridget, because she was touching on so many things that we have to consider in local government. And Sarah, have you got my slides ready? Yes. Oh, great. So Bridget talked about so many things, and I do think it's so important. And one thing that's more important than anything else, no matter what you're talking about in terms of numbers and figures and data and projects and infrastructure, it's people. People, and that's what's number one. And as a councillor, that's what I think about all the time, is people. And no matter whether you're thinking about those two big words in local government, finance, whether you're talking about revenue or capital, I always think it's really important to put people at the heart of everything you do. So if we go to slide number 2, Sarah. So there's the two words, and Bridget talked about, I know Bridget talks most about the revenue side, and that's what I'm going to talk about, because I know that Sarah, who's following me, should be talking more about the capital side. And the revenue side is very, very important. And it's also a very political side, even though it sounds very dull and mundane, because it's mostly about the day-to-day running of local council and local and what happens in day-to-day finance. But it is so political, and especially probably for us, because we're Labour since 2010, it's become even more political, the revenue side of local government. So the next slide talks about what all expenditure should be charged revenue accounts. So when you start as a councillor, many of you are councillors out there, and I know that some of you want to be councillors. There's always the expression, the revenue side, capital side, revenue budgets. But this is where these are the things which would come under the revenue account. So it's day-to-day running, which was already mentioned by Bridget. Employers, the premises, transport, supplies and services, transfer of payments, so that's housing benefits and things like that. Internal charges, so sometimes that's departments charging against one another, as well as income and income generating. And I'll just talk a little bit more about that later. Do you want to go to the next slide, please, Sarah? So councils, where they got their funding. So Bridget was already talking about it, and some of some people who else were also talking about it. So council tax is a big contribution to it, and Bridget already talked about how increasingly council tax is becoming more of part of the revenue, revenue source of money. When years ago it wasn't like that. So that's what a form of funding that comes into the revenue side. Also local, and also with council tax, it really varies on your area and what type of area. And if you have lots of much more wealthier properties, you'll be able to generate more council tax. And if you have much more high needs, then it doesn't work. It's much more unfair, and you can't generate as much income. Also, local business rates are important for local councils in terms of the revenue side of things. And we had, I think it was it Emily, I think, asking a question, or I think it was Karen. No, Emily was asking a question about business. Oh no, Liz, sorry. Liz was asking a question about business rate and how important it is. And especially through the pandemic, it was a really trying time for so many local business. And there's a lot of work going on in national government, which should be being pushed forward, because the whole system is very much out of date. Someone before talked also about how You know, especially if you're an online business, it's very much unfair to what's going on if you're a storefront business. Not only that, COVID's added an extra mix in all of this, because with social distancing, you know, a lot of local businesses are not going to make the money they had before when there was no social distancing. So there are concerns by many local businesses about the type of rate they are paying. The next one is fees and charges too. So that can be anything from a parking ticket to a fine that you get for a licensing fine, or a marriage certificate. That's where all that money comes in. But sometimes there's ring fencing of that money. So if you do make money on parking tickets, that has to go back into the parking department, or parking related or road related work. Plus there's central government funding. So now that's been a huge topic, because a lot of that's been reducing, especially since 2010, and Bridget talked about that. But all of these areas, whether you look at council tax, whether you look at business rates, whether you look at fees and charges, whether you look at central government, they all ask deeper questions about what type of local authority you want, how do you want to fund it, even if you're looking at revenue and day-to-day spending, you know, we have to ask our question, what do we want to do? So for that example of fees and charges, if your area has a large number of people who are on lower income, you know, do you put up the charges because it's going to deeply impact them? You know, so you have to think about things like that in local government, and it's really important. Do you put up business rates? I mean, places like Westminster that has lots and lots of business, you know, make a lot of money from business rates, but not all local authorities have big shops and things like that. So those are things you have to think about. And as a Labour person, you do have to think about those things very, very carefully. I also want to, so we in Greenwich, we actually share a crematorium with 2 other local authorities. And this crematorium charges fees and things like that, but it also makes a profit. However, we share it with 2 other Conservative local authorities. And at the end of the day, we usually have a meeting and we discuss the finance, and a Labour council, we always want to reduce the fees for the local residents when they come there. However, the Tory councillors always want to give the money back to the voters. So it's 2 different approaches to what you do with fees and charges. Can you move to the next slide, please, Sarah? So this is more areas of where the funding for the revenue comes from. That's fees and charges, what I talked about, the grants, the public health grant, which is before was ring fence, but now is no longer ring fence. And so that's those areas are all under a lot of pressure right now from central government. Do you want the next slide, please, Sarah? So this is something which I had to put in the slides. So it says councils are legally required to set a balanced budget by the 11th of March each year. So and this is still another thing that's very, very political. And there have been some issues throughout time with local authorities wanting to set budgets which were bigger than what they had. And so it's a very controversial issue. And I know some of you may have remembered, if you're old enough, like myself, like what happened in Liverpool and some other areas, but it's a legal requirement to set a balanced budget. But it's a question about whether or not you want your local authority, you know, because what happens sometimes if you choose not to, it can have hard repercussions. So you need to think about your local residents when you decide whether or not you want to set a balanced budget or not. But legally, you're supposed to. Every council is supposed to. Next slide, please. So this is as 2021. This is our revenue accounts for Greenwich Council. We've lost 130 million in government funding, so we have to make up that gap in some way or some form. And we've done that in a variety of ways. Some of it has included voluntary retirement, cutting services, trying to look for spending cuts. Go to the next slide, please, Sarah. So this is just a breakdown of how the money is distributed, that 284 million. every year, I do have to tell you, we overspend in children's and in health and adult social care. We overspend every year. It's mostly because there are legal requirements we have to make. If you've got a child being abused, you can't just leave them in the situation. Legally, you have to resolve it and solve it. And sometimes that means we have to overspend in that area. And many local authorities, it's children's services that overspend. Someone talked about the adult precept. We do add the adult precept to our council tax, but it hasn't helped in our situation. So, but those are some of the areas which how we break up our budget. The next one, that just says we have 130 million, yet the needs have increased and inflation has had a deep impact. Can the next slide, please, Sarah? So this basically says that for every pound that the government gives us, we lose 60p. So by 2020, local authorities have to face a reduction in core funding from government of nearly 16 billion over the preceding decade. Bridget was talking about some of that, but it's not a nice situation there. And I think it's going to get even more challenging for local authorities. Next. So these are some of the areas which have a lot of uncertainty. The business rates, that's been postponed. There's a reevaluation taking place and that's been postponed. And that's really worrying for some of us. Also the fair funding review too, that has not taken place and that's been delayed. And so these are some of the areas where the government can control and can do something about, but they're not. Some of it is they're using COVID as a way not to deal with it. But these are areas which I think Labour can have a stronger voice on, personally. The next slide, which is my final slide. So these are other factors, external factors, which are pressing on local government finance. And again, the revenue side of things, we have interest rates, we have inflation. So inflation can affect the cost of so many things, whether or not you're hiring new people or putting furniture in, the price of inflation. Brexit too is a underlying concern for us. That's very much a deep concern. The politics of the day, as you know, since 2010, we've in Greenwich has seen a tremendous amount of cuts, and I know that every local authority has seen that cuts. Demand for population. In fact, Greenwich and a large portion of East London experience increased population. When of that increased population, there are more social cares and social pressures there that go with it, but not necessarily more money to deal with it. Plus there's costs, and plus the ongoing impact of COVID-19 has an impact on our budget. So that's just sort of a whistle-stop tour of what's going on locally in my borough, but also just to explain more, especially for those who don't understand the difference between capital and revenue. And one thing you have to do as a councillor is understand those differences, but also to put forward you the challenges. But I think more than anything else, it's more about, it's the people. And you have to make tough decisions, but it's about putting the people first and trying to find ways and trying to get really creative about how do we make it the best for our most vulnerable residents. Okay, I think my time is up.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Denise. I mean, for 10 minutes, you certainly did pack a lot into that whistle-stop tour. That was brilliant. Thank you. I think there'll be lots of things to discuss from those slides and from Denise's presentation. I did make time, 5 minutes for a bit of a break, because I know sometimes when there's continuous talking, people get tired, but everyone looks very bright-eyed, bushy-tailed to me.
Oh,
I don't want to be a driver, but is everyone okay for us to plough ahead just to bring back some time, or do we want to take some time out? What do people think? Taking a straw poll of just hands, nods.
Keep going, keep going.
Keep going.
Oh, wow.
That's fabulous. There you go. I read them right, Denise. Absolutely. Yeah, so without further ado, let me introduce Councillor Sarah Russell from Manchester, and Sarah will be doing a tag team with Denise and building on some of the very important things Denise has spoken. Over to you, Sarah.
Good evening. So yeah, I'm Sarah Russell and I absolutely love local government finance. I mean, I really love it. I'm not an accountant, I'm not an auditor, I have no financial background at all whatsoever, but I have got progressively drawn in on a really geeky level in more and more detail into local government finance. And what I've been asked to talk about tonight specifically is about regeneration. And its economic impact and how we, and also its kind of UK-wide impact. So that's going to be my primary focus. I'm going to talk about Manchester because that is where I'm a councillor and what I know about. I am extremely enthusiastic about the city. I think the regeneration of it has been fantastic. It's not without some problems. I'm not pretending everything is perfect and it's not, but it has been a stunning success story. So I'm really excited about telling you about that success story. Then I hope I'll be able to pull it back to the national picture a little bit. And also I want to talk to you very briefly about money and power. So to begin about Manchester, so am I successfully screen sharing here?
Yes.
Yes,
yep.
You are.
Everyone can see? Great. Yep. So this is a Lowry picture, and in the early 1990s, Manchester city centre had 500 residents. Manchester was known nationally as Gunchester. And the city centre was and the whole city region actually really were in significant decline. By 2019, there were 60,000 people living in Manchester city centre, and that is expected to reach about 100,000 by 2025. And I'm sure that you can all see this beautiful picture of Manchester's skyline, and what you'll notice is all the cranes, because the amount of building and construction in Manchester over the last 10 years has been absolutely phenomenal. And building of 20-storey buildings in Greater Manchester has risen from, there were 12 of them in the year 2000. There were 37 by 2019. There are another 20 in construction at the moment, and another 25 have planning permission. Now, obviously, building buildings of itself is, I think Denise said, local government's really all about the people. But this scale of transformation has really significant potential impacts for people's lives. So how has Manchester been rebuilt? So we have had very stable political leadership in Manchester for quite a long time. So those who are familiar with our political scene might know that there are 96 councillors in Manchester. And I'm not talking about the Greater Manchester area here. I am just talking about Manchester itself. So we have 96 councillors, 94 of us are Labour. We've had the same leader for the last 20 plus years now, and he has had a very clear vision that Manchester is to be in the top flight of global cities by 2025, that it will provide a viable investment alternative to London and the South East, that it will attract global talent and investment, and that it will produce livable, attractive neighbourhoods where people can prosper economically, and that there'll be good transport links both within Manchester and Greater Manchester, but also to the rest of the country, and particularly across the rest of the north of England, because as a group, the major northern cities could contribute much more to the economy than they currently do. So what's the council done to facilitate this? So the council has absolutely driven an enormous amount of this development. The council held a lot of land in the city centre, and it has leveraged that land in conjunction with both foreign private direct investment, foreign government investment, UK government investment, and sometimes the private sector as well, to regenerate areas of the city, and has taken a piecemeal approach. So that picture that you can see there is an area called Spinningfields, which now looks quite a lot like Canary Wharf. In 1997, I think it was more or less a piece of wasteland, and the council sold that strategically to Allied London, who are an investment developer, who started developing it. We retained some leaseholds of some of the land, and actually when the development got into trouble during about 2007, 2008 in the recession, actually the council bought back some of the property within that to keep that regeneration scheme on track. And the council has done this in strategic areas around the city. So we haven't just been building offices and flats though, or helping other people to do so. The council has a really strategic vision of which sectors the council Manchester has potential strength in. So we've got great universities in Manchester and some general health innovation and biotech type businesses around. So we've had a real focus on health information and biotech, advanced materials and manufacturing, again growing out of the graphene research at the university. We have the largest tech centre in the UK outside of London. We have a lot of construction facilitating all the rest of it. And we have a major media and culture sector. And partly we fund the culture sector quite extensively. So the council, I think, spends about £10 million a year on galleries, which nationally I suspect is very high. And really, that's because we want people to want to continue to live in the city and to value the culture and the excitement that it provides. The council also developed the tram network. So we had an amazing visionary councillor, recently retired, who had the idea that Manchester should have a tram network, and that did indeed come about. And we also own the major share in the Manchester Airport Group, and we own a lot of the land around the airport. So it's not just been about the city centre vision, we're now developing the land around the airport, and there's a massive joint venture to develop that and to get some tech sector stuff going along there, alongside warehousing and other supply chain stuff for the airport. So in terms of the financing of this, this had, until COVID, been an incredibly positive and self-sustaining system. So the council owns a lot of the key assets, including city centre car parks, our convention centre and the airport. Manchester Airport Group was contributing about £70 million a year to our revenue budget until COVID hit. And we were getting significant revenue contributions from those other major assets as well. We still have holdings in the Arndale Centre, and there's quite a lot of different areas of the city where we own land still. The city centre flats, we've talked a bit about revenue and how important revenue is and tax. When we get a big new development of flats in the city centre, that's worth about 350 grand a year in council tax revenue. So all of those tower blocks and those cranes that you can see, and in a similar sense, actually, all the additional office space contributes massively to our tax base, and has helped us to become increasingly less dependent on central government, although we still receive quite a lot of grant from central government, and that's been cut by about 40% over the last 10 or so years, which has caused us huge problems. But nonetheless, the things that we reinvest that money into, that I personally am really proud of, and I think the whole council is very proud of, is we're a living wage employer, including through our care contracts. We top up our discretionary housing payment, which is used to help people sustain their tenancies who might otherwise be at risk of homelessness. We spend about £1 million a year on that, in addition to the amount we get from the government, and that's fairly unheard of across core cities. We managed to put an extra £1 million into our domestic violence and abuse services from last year, which will be spread over 3 years at a time when most local authorities have been cutting them. And where we have nurseries that are in council premises, we gave them additional grants during COVID on top of our government grants to nurseries, because we recognise the fragility of the childcare sector. And one of the things that I think is really important about Manchester City Council is that we have more than 50% women councillors. And AWS has been very successful in Manchester. And I think some of the things that you see there, some of those priorities really reflect the fact that we have a really strong group of women backbenchers. And we've used that. We also use our spending as best we can to promote local jobs, local spend with small and medium-sized enterprise, and we require our suppliers to provide local apprenticeships. The council spent, I think, something in the region of £300 million with our top suppliers in the last year. So that kind of local spend is a really significant local economic driver. So what do I think are the implications of all of this for the UK economy as a whole? I think what's important is that having an actual vision and pursuing it for a sustained period of time works. It's not a free market vision, it's a managed economy. I think it is a shame that we don't see more evidence of that from central government. The government is currently kind of pretending that that's what it's going to do via levelling up, but actually if you look at where that money's being spent, it's really about Tory marginals more than anything else. The final thing I wanted to say is about money and power. So the most important thing really is that you don't have to have masses of expertise in local government finance to become involved in it and to ask questions about it. I really became interested in it because I asked some questions at scrutiny, and I didn't know that much about money at the time, but I knew enough to work out that when the Exec Member for Finance was getting aggressive and defensive, that I must have picked up on something that was a problem. So I just kept asking. And that's about life experience. You can develop detailed expertise later, but actually there are other skills that really matter when you're asking questions about money. And the final thing I'd say is when you're having conversations, whether that's within your council or if you're a Labour Party member with your local councillors, say, please always ask, what is the budget for that? Because actually it's so easy for politicians at whatever level to talk a great talk about how marvellous something is going to be and how important something is to them. But actually, if there's not a decent wad of money behind it, then they don't care about it that much, really, and they're probably going to struggle to deliver anything meaningful. Money by itself is not enough to provide real change, but without it, it is very difficult to do. I think on that note, I will finish. I hope that's been useful and informative. It was a bit of a canter through, but I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. With Denise's whistle stop and your canter, I think we've got some movement going there. I think we are at a stage now where we're 2 minutes saving 2 minutes in terms of our timing. So I'd like to split us up into 2 groups. Ladies, this is your opportunity to join either Lucia Das Neves' group or Josie's group. And I think, Emily, you're helping us with the split, is that right?
I am. I'm going to attempt to anyway. Let me I'll just do this now. So 15 minutes, Chair, is that right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. We gather back at about 8:25 just to feed back on a few points from both groups and then wrap up and enjoy the evening.
Great. Just give me a moment. Sorry. There we go. You should get a notification.
Yeah.
An invitation.
Are we all back, I wonder? Let me just see. I actually know, I think.
Not yet.
Yeah. Right, oh right, Lucia, your team made it back first. I think I was part of Josie's, and Denise has just popped in the room, so that's obviously a sign that everybody's coming back.
Yeah, my group's back.
Yeah, fabulous, fabulous. Great. Okay, so we have another 5 minutes left, and what I'm probably thinking is best is to get some brief feedback from both groups. So Josie and Lucia. Lucia, since you're sharing my screen, I'm going to hand over to you to give us a brief
Okay.
First.
Okay, thanks, Mariah. Great. So quick whistle stop, but really interesting and a bit diverse conversation. We talked about the issues of the strict rules of local government spending and the challenges around managing expectations, especially Labour members' expectations and desires. We touched on the issues with commercial relationships. So some boroughs, generating income streams by using capital, but then a bit of a question mark over what happens post-pandemic and will they hit trouble, and will they be exposed financially? And we talked a little bit about the pandemic and the uncertainties of will we open up, won't we? What will the autumn hold? I touched a bit on the impact of unemployment in my borough, and also what that means for the possibility of sustainable revenue generation. And lastly, to quote someone in the group, the fact that we're sometimes forced to build monstrosities just because they pay for other things, and that's just the way that things have worked out, even though that's not really what we would have chosen.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I was just soliloquizing to myself and saying that's politics sometimes, isn't it? But anyway, moving swiftly on. We have Josie. Josie, are you around?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to hand over to one of the group members to say what we discussed, because, you know, my children are decided not to go to bed tonight, and also have connection issues. But yeah, somebody else, I think there was a very in-depth discussion actually.
Yes.
So I'll hand over.
So does Helen, I think Helen, would you like to? Is she there?
Helen, are you there? No? How about
Louise? Louise, did you want to?
Oh, Louise.
Oh, Karen did it. Karen, you want to give feedback?
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I took over a bit. I do apologise to the rest of the group.
You're brilliant. Go on.
Honestly, I do. I'm very sorry. We started with a bit of a discussion about Denise's presentation and how useful that was, and how that was very helpful, particularly from people who were relatively new to council finance, and to people who were perhaps in opposition to really understand some of the intricacies of local government finance, and really appreciative of the fact that it was put in relatively simple terms. It was really easy to understand. And then somebody made the mistake of asking about adult social care, I think. I can't even remember if it was me who started it, so we ranted about that for a while. So the conversation was very much about adult social care and the government's response to the funding crisis being around temporary funding, which means that it's impossible to plan your budgets properly because you don't know where the money's coming from, you don't know how long it's going to last for, you can't use it for revenue spend, and all of those other issues, at the same time that you have all of the additional pressures on that budget around an ageing and increasingly older population, as well as a lot of younger people coming into the system with learning disabilities and complex autism. So we had a discussion about that and what the Labour Party's response should be, and what we felt is taxation the answer? Personally, I think it is. But that's how do we balance the message about Labour being a high spend, high taxation party with actually that need to share the risk across the whole of the population in the way that we do with healthcare, for example?
Yeah, No, that's brilliant, Karen. Thank you. These are all very complex and meaty issues that, you know, we could be here the whole week debating and thinking about it. But I know that I was discussing with another colleague about National Policy Forum and how we begin to feed some of these key issues in, because it's quite clear that the government at the moment is grappling somewhat unsuccessfully around some of these issues. I have to say, it has to be said, Sarah. So I think from my point of view, there are, you know, very key and pertinent issues that have been raised here. And some of the key things that have come out to me from the whole conversation is the relationship between money and power. Where the money goes, there goes the power. And I think it was somebody within Josie's group that was talking about the fact that if people are going on about a project, people being politicians, and you ask how much the budget is, and it's a piddly budget or it's from a temporary source, Karen, then you know there's either they don't count it as much or there's going to be problems in the future. And the other thing that I think I heard quite clearly from Bridget was about the taxing regime and how that fits into the finance system that we currently have. I mean, when you're looking at sort of the macro level, how do we revise the taxing system, which I think somebody bravely said here was completely broken. And I agree with some parts of that. So there are some major issues which, you know, we won't solve in an hour and a half, but it is good to note them. We are recording these sessions. And one of the things that I know Sarah Hyde is hoping to do with the rest of the planning committee is have consequence sessions where we look at, you know, issues that have been raised through these sessions. So do expect that we bring this back and delve into it in a much more detailed level. I'd like to thank everybody. I know that it's you know, been 1.5 hours without any break, and it just shows what women can do when we put our minds to it. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the Councillor Network on behalf of this planning committee, because people like Denise, Sarah Russell, who've given us fabulous meaty presentations, are from the same network. You know, we'd actually be having a very boring session without you. So thank you very much, Denise, Sarah, and to the Councillor Network. I'd like to thank the planning committee who've, you know, revolved around this. So Emily, Sarah, Mariana, I think Emily as well. I've mentioned Emily. I'm leaving somebody out, Josie, that's it, who's obviously being handled by the kids there, as I was a few minutes ago. Thank you very much. I'd like to make a plug for our next session, which is on the 16th of June, and the topic is tax doesn't need to be taxing. We'll have Dame Angela Eagle there, so it promises to be very lively, if nothing else. Please do come along, come with your thinking caps as usual, and I think I'm done. Sarah Hyde, are you there somewhere in the background? Did you want to say
thank you to Mariah. This is the first thing that Mariah has chaired for Fabian Women's Network, and I think you've done an excellent job. So all that's left to say is have a great evening, everybody. Thank you, Mariah, and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you. Have a good evening.